When a man reaches his 70s and realizes he has nothing to show for a lifetime of wandering, the weight of that emptiness can crush even the strongest spirit. For Levi McCallum and Jesse Talbot, two aging mountain men who had watched their world disappear piece by piece, that moment came when they buried the last person who remembered their names. These old friends had spent 50 years in the Colorado wilderness, but now they faced something scarier than any grizzly or blizzard, the prospect of dying forgotten. Then they heard about an abandoned castle hidden deep in the mountains, built by a dreamer who'd lost everything. Maybe two broken-down trappers could find something worth building in those crumbling stones. But what secret would they discover that changed everything they thought they knew about starting over? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Levi McCallum sat on the porch of his weathered cabin, holding a photograph that had yellowed with age. The image showed two young men, barely 20, standing beside a freshly killed elk, their faces bright with the confidence that comes from believing the world belongs to you. One had been Jesse Talbot, his partner in 1,000 adventures. The other had been himself, though he barely recognized that eager boy anymore. 53 years had passed since that photograph was taken. 53 years of following game trails through virgin forests, of sleeping under star-drunk skies, of living by skills their grandfathers had taught them when the frontier still meant something. Now at 73, Levi's hands were gnarled like old pine roots. His back curved from decades of carrying heavy packs, and his once keen eyes required spectacles to read the fine print on his pension checks. The cabin around him told the story of a life lived simply but fully. Hand-hewn log walls bore the marks of his own axe, chinked with moss and clay he'd gathered from the creek bed. Animal pelts hung from pegs, beaver, fox, and the occasional bear hide, that served as both trophy and practical covering. Mason jars lined rough-cut shelves, filled with preserves, pickled vegetables, and the last of his grandfather's moonshine recipe. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires that had warmed his bones through Colorado's brutal winters. But the cabin felt too quiet now, too empty. For 30 years, it had been a refuge he'd shared with his wife Martha. She'd taken to mountain life like she was born to it, learning to can vegetables, mend clothes by lamplight, and shoot straight enough to bring down a deer when winter supplies ran low. Her laughter had filled these rooms, her gentle humming while she worked at the kitchen table, her warm presence in their bed during the long, cold nights. Martha had been gone 3 years now, taken by a cancer that no amount of wilderness wisdom could cure. The doctor in town had used words like aggressive and terminal, but all Levi understood was that the woman who'd made his hermit's life complete was slipping away, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. He'd held her hand through those final weeks, listening to her stories about their early days together, about the children they'd never had, about her hopes that he'd find some peace after she was gone. Peace. That was a word that seemed to mock him now. Every morning brought the same routine. Coffee black and bitter, a simple breakfast of eggs and bacon, checking his few remaining snares, tending to his small garden. Every evening brought the same silence, the same loneliness, the same creeping awareness that his story was winding toward an ending no one would remember. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke his reverie. Jesse Talbot rode up the narrow trail on his old sorrel mare, Penny, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that hurried movement could mean a broken hip and a slow death in the wilderness. Jesse looked every bit as weathered as Levi felt. His face was a map of wrinkles carved by sun and wind, his white beard stained yellow from decades of pipe tobacco. His clothes patched and repatched until the original fabric was more memory than reality. "Morning, Grizzle," Jesse called out, using the nickname Levi had earned in his 20s after wrestling a black bear away from their food cache. "You're looking particularly cheerful today," Levi grunted and gestured to the empty chair beside him. about as cheerful as a man can be when he's contemplating his own irrelevance. Jesse dismounted with a series of pops and creaks from joints that had endured too much cold and too many hard impacts. He tied Penny to the hitching post and settled into the chair with a long sigh. "Well, that's a fine way to greet an old friend. What's got your tail in a twist this morning?" Levi held up the photograph. "Found this in Martha's things yesterday. Look at us, Jesse. Look at what we used to be." Jesse studied the image, his expression growing thoughtful. "I remember that day. We'd been tracking that elk for 3 days. Thought we were the finest hunters who ever drew breath. We were going to conquer the whole damn mountain range. And what do we have to show for it? 2 old men living in cabins that'll rot to nothing once we're gone. No children to carry on our names. No legacy worth a plugged nickel. Hell, the young folks in town don't even know what we used to do up here." Jesse pulled out his pipe and began the familiar ritual of packing it with tobacco. "You know, Whip and I never had kids either," he said, referring to his late wife by the nickname he'd given her for her sharp tongue and quicker wit. "Always figured there'd be time for that later, when we'd settled down proper. Then later never came, and Whip passed on, and here I am, talking to myself most days, except when I ride over to pester you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. 2 old men who'd shared enough experiences that words weren't always necessary. The valley spread out below them, a patchwork of meadow and forest that had been their hunting ground for decades. Elk still grazed in the distance, their antlers catching the morning light. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with the kind of effortless grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to this harsh but beautiful country. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Jesse said eventually, sending up a cloud of pipe smoke that mingled with the mountain air. "Remember old Tom Brennan? Used to run supplies up to the mining camps before the silver played out?" Levi nodded. Tom had been a fixture in their world for years, a gregarious Irishman who'd known every trail and every story from Denver to the Continental Divide. He'd passed away the previous winter, another link to their past severed by time's relentless march. "Well, before Tom died, he told me something that's been eating at me ever since. You remember the stories about that crazy German fellow, Baron von Müller? The one who built that castle up in the high country back in the 1870s? The fairy tale castle? Sure, I remember the stories. Supposed to be somewhere up near Phantom Creek, but nobody's ever found hide nor hair of it. Most folks figured it was just another tall tale." Jesse leaned forward, his eyes bright with the first excitement Levi had seen in them for months. "Tom swore he'd seen it, Grizzle. Said he stumbled across it by accident when he was hunting elk about 15 years ago. Described it as looking like something out of a storybook, stone towers and everything, but all overgrown with vines and trees growing right up through the floor." Levi frowned. "Tom told a lot of stories, Jesse. Half of them were probably whiskey talking. That's what I thought too, until he gave me this." Jesse reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's a map, Grizzle, and drawn, with landmarks I recognize. Tom said he always meant to go back, but never got around to it. Made me promise to find the place before I got too old to appreciate it." Levi took the map and studied it carefully. The paper was old but well preserved, marked with pencil lines that showed the route from familiar landmarks: Iron Falls, Devil's Backbone Ridge, the twin peaks called the Sisters. The drawing was detailed enough to suggest it came from someone who'd actually made the journey. Not just a dreamer spinning fantasies. "Even if this is real," Levi said slowly, "what would we want with some old ruin? We're past the age for treasure hunting, Jesse." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had defined their lives. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of longing that Levi recognized in his own heart. "Maybe we're not looking for treasure, Grizzle. Maybe we're looking for something else. A place where 2 old men could leave their mark, build something worth remembering. You said it yourself. We've got nothing to show for all these years. What if that castle could be our legacy? What if we could restore it, make it into something beautiful before our time runs out?" The idea settled into Levi's mind like a seed finding fertile ground. He thought about the empty cabin behind him, about the long, lonely days that stretched ahead, about the growing certainty that he was becoming invisible in a world that had moved past him. The prospect of one last adventure, one final chance to build something meaningful, stirred emotions he'd thought were buried with Martha. "It's probably a fool's errand," he said finally. "Probably," Jesse agreed. "But what else are we going to do with our time? Sit here feeling sorry for ourselves until we die? At least this way, if we fail trying to do something worthwhile." Levi looked at the photograph again, seeing not the young men they'd been, but the old men they'd become, weathered, experienced, still capable despite their years. Maybe Jesse was right. Maybe it was time for one more adventure, one last chance to prove they still had something to offer the world. "How far do you reckon it is?" he asked, studying the map more carefully. Jesse grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger and more hopeful. "Tom figured about a 4-day ride, if we take our time and don't push too hard. We could pack light, camp rough like we used to. Hell, it might even be fun." As they planned their expedition, both men felt something they hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The castle might be nothing but rubble and disappointment, but the journey itself represented something precious, the chance to feel useful again, to have a goal that mattered, to leave behind the gradual diminishment that had defined their recent years. The mountain wind stirred the aspen leaves, creating a sound like distant applause, as if the wilderness itself was encouraging their plans. 3 days later, Levi woke before dawn, with the peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread that comes with embarking on something that might be either magnificent or foolish. He'd spent the intervening time preparing for their expedition with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that wilderness survival depended on countless small decisions made correctly. His pack contained essentials accumulated over a lifetime of mountain experience: jerky, hardtack, coffee, a small pot, matches wrapped in oilcloth, fishing line, and 100 other items that could mean the difference between comfort and misery in the backcountry. Jesse arrived as planned, leading a pack mule named Buster that looked as ancient and stubborn as they were. The animal's grey muzzle and rheumy eyes suggested he'd seen as many seasons as his human companions. But his sure-footed gait and steady temperament made him ideal for navigating treacherous mountain trails. "Ready for our grand adventure, Grizzle?" Jesse asked, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. In the cold light of dawn, with their mortality hanging around them like morning mist, the expedition felt less like a romantic quest and more like the possibly dangerous whim of 2 men who should know better. "Ready as I'll ever be," Levi replied, shouldering his pack and feeling the familiar weight settle against his spine. The gesture awakened muscle memories from thousands of similar moments, the beginning of hunting expeditions, exploration trips, and the countless journeys that had defined their lives in the high country. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern peaks, casting the valley in shades of gold and amber that made everything look touched by magic. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze, past meadows where late-season wildflowers nodded in the grass, alongside streams that chattered with the urgent voice of snowmelt seeking lower ground. For the first few hours, they traveled in comfortable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts and memories of similar journeys taken in younger days. The rhythm of their horses' hoofbeats, the creak of leather, and the occasional snort or shuffle from Buster created a soundtrack that felt as familiar as breathing. This was what they knew, what they'd always known: the mountain trails, the endless sky, the sense of moving through a landscape that remained largely unchanged since their grandfather's time. By midday, they'd reached Iron Falls, the first landmark on Tom Brennan's map. The waterfall cascaded down a granite cliff face in a series of steps, each pool reflecting the sky like a mirror before spilling into the next level. It was a place both men had visited countless times over the decades, a reliable source of fresh water and a natural gathering point for game. Jesse dismounted and pulled out the map. comparing Tom's markings to the actual terrain. "He's got the falls marked just right," he said. "And there's the lightning-struck pine he mentioned. According to this, we need to head northwest from here, following that ridgeline toward Devil's Backbone." As they prepared to leave the familiar territory of Iron Falls behind, both men felt a shift in the nature of their journey. Up to this point, they'd been traveling through country they knew intimately, following trails they'd ridden dozens of times. From here on, they would be venturing into the unknown, guided only by the map of a dead man and their own fading confidence in their abilities. The afternoon brought challenges that reminded them both of their age and limitations. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, winding through dense forest, where fallen trees blocked the path and loose rocks threatened to send an unwary horse tumbling into the ravine below. What would have been a minor inconvenience in their younger days became serious obstacles that required careful planning and cautious navigation. Levi's back began to ache from the constant shifting required to maintain balance on his horse, and Jesse developed a persistent cough from the thin air at higher elevation. Buster, despite his age, proved to be the most reliable member of their party, picking his way through difficult terrain with the patience of an animal who'd learned that steady progress beats reckless speed. As evening approached, they found themselves on a narrow ledge with a spectacular view of the valley far below. The sunset painted the western peaks in shades of crimson and purple, creating a vista that would have taken their breath away if they'd had any breath left to lose. They made camp in a small clearing protected by a ring of pine trees, their movements slow and deliberate as they went through the familiar routine of setting up for the night. While Jesse tended to the horses and mule, Levi built a fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon. The familiar tasks were comforting, connecting them to countless other evenings spent around campfires in the wilderness. But something felt different this time, a sense of urgency perhaps, or the awareness that this might be among the last such evenings they would share. "Tom's map shows we should reach Devil's Backbone tomorrow afternoon," Jesse said, as they sat beside the fire, sharing a pot of coffee that tasted like home and memories. "From there, it's another day's ride to where he marked the castle." Levi poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks that danced against the darkening sky. "You ever wonder what we'll do if we actually find it? I mean, really find it. Not just some pile of stones that might have been a foundation once upon a time." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I keep thinking about something Whip said to me before she died. She said the measure of a man's life wasn't in what he accumulated, but in what he built that would outlast him. I never really understood what she meant until now. And you think this castle, if it exists, could be that kind of legacy? Maybe, or maybe the real legacy is just proving to ourselves that we're not ready for the rocking chair yet, that we can still take on something big and see it through to the end." As the fire burned down to coals, they prepared for sleep with the efficiency born of long practice. But sleep didn't come easily to either man. They lay in their bedrolls, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the pine needles, and each wrestled with his own doubts and fears. Levi found himself thinking about Martha, wondering what she would make of this adventure. She'd always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his enthusiasm for new projects threatened to override common sense. But she'd also been the one who encouraged him to dream, to reach for something beyond the simple maintenance of their mountain existence. Jesse's thoughts turned to the years since Whip's death, the gradual narrowing of his world until it consisted of little more than daily survival and weekly trips to town for supplies. He told himself he was content with this reduced existence, but the truth was that he'd been slowly disappearing, becoming as invisible as the morning mist that burned off with the rising sun. The next morning brought a discovery that would change everything. As they broke camp and prepared to continue their journey, Jesse was securing the pack on Buster's back when something fell from the mule's gear, a leather-wrapped bundle that none of them remembered packing. Jesse picked it up and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of old papers tied with a faded ribbon. "What is that?" Levi asked, moving closer to examine the bundle. Jesse's hands shook slightly as he untied the ribbon and spread out the papers. They were architectural drawings, detailed plans for a castle that looked like something from a European fairy tale, complete with towers, battlements, and a great hall. At the bottom of each page, in faded but legible script, was the signature Heinrich von Müller, 1876. "Sweet Jesus," Levi breathed. "These must be the original plans for the castle. But how did they end up in Buster's pack?" Jesse's voice was barely a whisper. "Tom must have hidden them there before he died. He knew we'd find them when we needed them most." As they studied the plans more closely, both men felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The castle depicted in these drawings wasn't just a simple frontier dwelling. It was an ambitious architectural marvel, a testament to one man's determination to create something beautiful in the wilderness. And if these plans were authentic, if the castle had actually been built according to these specifications, then what they were searching for was far more significant than either of them had imagined. The drawings changed everything. What had begun as a half-hearted quest to find some old ruins had suddenly become a mission to locate and possibly restore a genuine architectural treasure. The weight of that possibility, and the responsibility that came with it, settled over them like a heavy blanket. They packed the drawings carefully and continued their journey with a new sense of purpose and urgency. The castle was no longer just a destination, it was a calling. The discovery of the architectural drawings had transformed their journey from a sentimental quest into something approaching pilgrimage. As they rode through the morning mist toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, both men found themselves stealing glances at the leather bundle secured in Jesse's saddlebag, as if the plans might somehow disappear, if not regularly. Confirmed, Devil's Backbone proved to be aptly named, a narrow ridge of granite that jutted from the mountainside. Like the fossilized spine of some enormous prehistoric beast, the trail along its crest was treacherous, barely wide enough for a single horse, with steep drops on either side that plunged into shadows so deep they seemed to swallow light itself. One misstep would mean certain death, a reality that made every hoofbeat feel like a small victory against mortality. "Take it slow, Grizzle," Jesse called from behind, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from truly understanding consequences. "This isn't the place to prove we're still young." Levi nodded, without turning around, all his attention focused on guiding his horse along the narrow path. His mount, a steady gelding named Ranger, had carried him safely through dozens of similar passages over the years. But even the most reliable horse could stumble, and at their age, recovery from serious injury was far from certain. Halfway across the ridge, they encountered their first serious obstacle. A recent rock slide had partially blocked the trail, leaving a gap barely wide enough for a careful horse to navigate. The alternative was a detour that would add at least 2 days to their journey, time they weren't sure their aging bodies could afford. "What do you think?" Jesse asked, studying the narrow passage with the calculating eye of a man who'd spent his life making life-and-death decisions in the wilderness. Levi dismounted and examined the footing carefully, testing each stone for stability. The passage was possible, but it would require dismounting and leading the animals through one at a time, with someone spotting from behind to catch them if they stumbled. "We can make it," he said finally, "but we'll need to be smart about it. You take Penny through first. She's the most sure-footed. Then Buster, then Ranger. I'll go last and help guide them from behind." The process took nearly an hour, each animal requiring patient coaxing and careful guidance through the treacherous passage. Jesse's hands shook with exhaustion by the time they'd gotten all 3 animals safely across, and Levi's bad knee, injured in a fall years earlier, had begun to throb with the kind of deep pain that promised days of misery. But they'd made it, and the sense of accomplishment that came with overcoming the obstacle together reminded them both of why they'd been such effective partners in their younger days. They'd always been good at reading each other's strengths and weaknesses, at knowing when to push forward and when to exercise caution. On the far side of Devil's Backbone, the landscape opened into a vast meadow surrounded by peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. Wildflowers carpeted the grass in a riot of color. Indian paintbrush, lupine, columbine, and dozens of species they couldn't name but had admired for decades. A small stream meandered through the center of the meadow, its water so clear they could see trout darting between the rocks like liquid shadows. "This is what I'm going to miss most," Jesse said as they paused to rest the animals and themselves. "Not the hardship or the danger, but this, the moments when you remember why you fell in love with the country in the first place." Levi understood exactly what his friend meant. There was something about the high country that got into a man's blood, something that made civilized life feel cramped and artificial by comparison. Up here, surrounded by peaks that had stood since before human memory, a man could feel both infinitely small and profoundly connected to something larger than himself. They made camp early that evening beside the stream, both men acknowledging without words that they needed rest more than they needed to maintain their previous day's pace. While Jesse tended to the animals, Levi caught 2 fat trout for their dinner. The familiar motions of casting and retrieving, bringing back memories of countless evenings spent in similar pursuit. As they prepared their meal, Jesse pulled out the architectural drawings again, spreading them carefully on a flat rock beside the fire. In the flickering light, the castle's design took on an almost magical quality, the towers seeming to reach toward heaven, the great hall promising warmth and fellowship, the whole structure representing someone's dream of creating paradise in the wilderness. "Look at this detail," Jesse said, pointing to a section of the drawings that showed the castle's foundation. Von Muller planned for everything: drainage, ventilation, even a system for collecting rainwater. This wasn't just some rich man's folly. This was serious architecture. Levi studied the drawings more carefully, his respect for the long-dead German growing with each detail he noticed. The castle had been designed not just to impress, but to endure. Every element served both aesthetic and practical purposes, suggesting an architect who understood the challenges of mountain construction. "If it was built according to these plans," Levi said slowly, "and if it survived nearly 50 years of weather, then what we're looking for is something special, something worth preserving." As the fire burned lower, they found themselves planning not just how to find the castle, but what they might do if they discovered it in good condition. The drawings had awakened something in both men, a vision of what their remaining years might hold if they dedicated themselves to restoration rather than slow decline. "We'd need supplies," Jesse said thoughtfully. "Tools, materials, probably help from younger men for the heavy lifting." "It wouldn't be cheap. I've got some money put away," Levi replied. "Martha was always careful about saving, and I haven't had much to spend it on since she passed." "What about you?" Jesse nodded. "Enough to make a start anyway. And if we could show people what we were trying to do, maybe we could find others willing to help. There's got to be folks out there who understand the value of preserving something like this." The conversation continued late into the night. 2 old men rebuilding their dreams around the possibility of bringing someone else's vision back to life. The prospect of having a meaningful project, something that would challenge their skills and give purpose to their remaining years, had awakened an energy they'd thought was lost forever. But as they settled into their bedrolls, both men wrestled with doubts that the darkness seemed to magnify. They were old, tired, and far from any help if things went wrong. The castle might be nothing but ruins, the drawings might be fantasy rather than reality, and their grand plans might crumble like morning mist before the sun. Yet something had changed in them since finding the drawings. The careful pessimism that had protected them from disappointment in recent years was giving way to something more dangerous and more alive: hope. They were no longer just 2 old men killing time until time killed them. They were explorers again, seekers, men with a mission that mattered. The mountain wind sang through the pine needles above them, A lullaby as old as the peaks themselves, carrying dreams and possibilities on its ancient voice. Dawn broke grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that soaks through clothing and settles into a man's bones. Levi woke to find frost on his bedroll, despite it being late September, a reminder that winter came early and stayed late in the high country. His knee throbbed with a deep ache that promised a difficult day ahead. While Jesse's persistent cough had worsened during the night. "Maybe we should consider turning back," Jesse said as they broke camp, his voice hoarse and uncertain. The enthusiasm that had carried them through the previous day seemed dampened by the reality of cold, wet misery and the growing awareness of their physical limitations. Levi looked at his old friend with concern. Jesse's color was poor. His hands trembled slightly as he packed his gear, and the cough that rattled in his chest sounded deeper and more persistent than it had the day before. They were still 2 days from their destination, assuming Tom's map was accurate. And at least 3 days from any help if something went seriously wrong. "Your call." "Partner," Levi said, though he could feel his own disappointment settling like a stone in his stomach. "We don't have anything to prove to anybody." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cloud-shrouded peaks that surrounded them. When he spoke, his voice carried a determination that surprised them both. "No," he said firmly. "We've come too far to quit because of a little weather and some aches and pains. If we turn back now, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what we might have found." As they rode through the morning gloom, both men found themselves thinking about the choices that had defined their lives. The decisions to leave civilization behind, to make their living in the wilderness, to remain childless, to grow old without conventional measures of success. Those choices had seemed natural and right at the time, but now, facing the possibility of dying without leaving any meaningful mark on the world, they felt the weight of paths not taken. The trail wound through dense forest, where massive pines blocked out what little light filtered through the clouds. Water dripped constantly from the branches above, creating a steady percussion that might have been soothing under better circumstances, but now felt like nature's way of testing their resolve. Buster plodded along stoically, his pack covered with a canvas tarp that shed most of the moisture, while the horses stepped carefully through mud that grew deeper and more treacherous with each passing hour. Around midday, they encountered another traveler, a young man on a sturdy bay horse, leading a pack animal loaded with surveying equipment. He appeared through the mist like a ghost, his yellow rain slicker bright against the dark forest. And both old men felt a moment of surprise at meeting someone else in such remote country. "Afternoon," the stranger called out as he approached. He appeared to be in his 30s, with the kind of efficient movements and alert demeanor that marked him as someone comfortable in the wilderness. "Rough day to be traveling. I'm David Morrison with the Forest Service, doing some mapping work up here." "Levi McCallum," Levi replied, touching the brim of his hat. "This is Jesse Talbot. We're just doing a little exploring in our retirement." Morrison studied them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating travelers in remote areas. His gaze took in their age, their equipment, and the challenging conditions they were traveling through. "You fellows picked some difficult country for sightseeing," he said, not unkindly. "How far are you planning to go?" Jesse pulled out Tom's map, keeping the architectural drawings carefully hidden. "We're looking for an old place called Phantom Creek. Ever heard of it?" Morrison frowned thoughtfully. "I've seen that name on some of the old territorial maps, but I've never been there myself. According to my charts, you're still a good day's ride from that area, maybe more in these conditions." He paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Look, I don't mean to interfere, but this weather's supposed to get worse over the next few days. Early snow's forecast for the high elevations. You might want to consider heading back to lower ground." Levi felt Jesse tense beside him and knew his friend was fighting the same internal battle between wisdom and determination that he was experiencing himself. Morrison's advice made perfect sense. They were old, the weather was deteriorating, and they were heading into increasingly remote country where help would be impossible to summon. "We appreciate the warning," Jesse said finally. but we've got good gear and plenty of experience. We'll be fine, Morrison shrugged, recognizing the tone of men who'd made up their minds. Your choice. Just be careful up there. The country around Phantom Creek is rough even in good weather. He urged his horse forward, then paused and looked back. By the way, if you do make it that far, keep an eye out for anything unusual. There've been rumors for years about some old structure up in that area, but nobody's ever been able to confirm it. After Morrison disappeared back into the mist, Levi and Jesse rode in thoughtful silence. The surveyor's words about early snow weighed heavily on both their minds. They'd lived in the mountains long enough to know that September storms could dump several feet of snow without warning, and being caught in a blizzard at their age would likely be a death sentence. But Morrison's casual mention of rumors about an old structure had also confirmed something important. They weren't chasing a complete fantasy. If a Forest Service surveyor had heard stories about something in the Phantom Creek area, then their quest might not be as foolish as their aching bones suggested. By late afternoon, the drizzle had turned to intermittent snow flurries, and the temperature had dropped enough that their breath formed clouds when they spoke. They made camp in a grove of ancient pines that provided some shelter from the wind, building a larger fire than usual and stringing a tarp between trees to create a dry space for their gear. As they prepared their evening meal, Jesse produced an unexpected artifact from his saddlebag, a small wooden carving of a castle that he'd been working on during quiet moments over the past few days. The carving was remarkably detailed despite being only a few inches tall, clearly based on von Müller's architectural drawings. "Been keeping my hands busy," Jesse explained, seeming almost embarrassed by the admission. "Whip always said I was good with small work, and I wanted something to remind us what we're looking for." Levi examined the carving carefully, impressed by the skill that had gone into its creation. Every tower, every window, every architectural detail had been faithfully reproduced in miniature. It was more than just a carving. It was a testament to the vision that was driving them forward, a tangible reminder of the dream they were pursuing. It's beautiful work. Jesse, Martha would have loved it. Levi paused, studying the tiny castle in the firelight. You know what this represents? It's not just von Müller's dream anymore. It's become ours too. As the snow continued to fall and the wind picked up, both men felt the weight of the decision they'd made. They were committed now, for better or worse, to seeing their quest through to its conclusion. The alternative, turning back and spending the rest of their lives wondering what they might have found, was no longer acceptable. The small wooden castle sat between them beside the fire, a symbol of hope carved from the hands of a man who'd finally found something worth pursuing in the twilight of his years. They woke to a world transformed by snow. What had begun as scattered flurries the night before had become a steady snowfall that blanketed everything in pristine white. The silence was profound and unsettling, the kind of deep quiet that only comes with heavy snow, muffling every sound and creating a sense of isolation that pressed against the mind like a physical weight. "Well, that settles that," Jesse said, emerging from his bedroll with frost on his mustache and resignation in his voice. "We're not going anywhere today." Levi stood and surveyed their situation with the calm assessment of a man who'd weathered many such storms. The snow was already 6 inches deep and falling steadily, with no sign of letting up. Their horses stood hunched against the cold, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air, while Buster regarded the white landscape with the stoic patience of an animal who'd learned that weather was something to endure rather than fight. "Could be worse," Levi said, though he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "We've got food for several days, plenty of firewood and decent shelter. We just need to wait it out." But as the day progressed, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a brief mountain squall. The snow continued falling with relentless consistency, piling deeper with each passing hour. By afternoon, it was knee-deep and showing no signs of diminishing. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and the wind had picked up enough to create drifts that made travel impossible, even if they'd been willing to risk it. Jesse's cough grew worse as the day wore on, developing a harsh, rasping quality that worried Levi more than he was willing to admit. They'd both lived in the mountains long enough to know that respiratory problems could turn serious quickly in cold, high-altitude conditions. Without access to medical care, even a simple chest cold could become life-threatening. Maybe Morrison was right, Jesse said as they huddled around the fire that evening, his voice barely audible over the wind. Maybe we should have turned back when we had the chance. Levi looked at his friend with growing concern. Jesse's face was pale and drawn. His hands shook when he lifted his coffee cup, and his breathing had become labored and shallow. For the first time since they'd begun their journey, Levi found himself seriously questioning the wisdom of their quest. "We'll reassess in the morning," he said gently. "If the weather breaks, we can make a decision about whether to push forward or head back to lower ground." But even as he spoke the words, Levi knew that turning back might no longer be an option. The snow was falling too heavily for them to retrace their steps safely, and the high passes they'd crossed might already be impassable. They were committed to their course now, whether they wanted to be or not. That night, unable to sleep because of worry about Jesse and their deteriorating situation, Levi found himself thinking about the choices that had brought them to this point. They could have remained safely in their cabins, could have accepted the gradual diminishment of age with resignation and dignity. Instead, they'd chosen to reach for something beyond themselves, to pursue a dream that might well cost them their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. In seeking to create a legacy, to build something that would outlast them, they might have ensured that they'd never have the chance to build anything at all. The quest that had begun as a way to give meaning to their remaining years might end those years prematurely. But as he listened to the wind howling through the pine trees and watched the snow continue to fall beyond their small circle of firelight, Levi realized something unexpected. Even if this journey ended in disaster, even if they never found the castle or lived to tell anyone about their search, the past few days had given him something precious, a sense of purpose and adventure that had been missing from his life since Martha's death. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified overnight, driven by winds that sent the snow swirling in patterns that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. Jesse was noticeably worse, his cough now accompanied by a fever that left him weak and disoriented. "I don't think I can travel today." "Grizzle," he admitted, a confession that would have been unthinkable from the proud mountain man just days earlier. "Maybe not tomorrow either." Levi helped his friend settle more comfortably by the fire, piling extra blankets around him and preparing a hot meal that might help restore some strength. As he worked, he found himself studying Tom Brennan's map with new urgency. According to the markings, they were close to their destination, possibly within a day's ride if the weather cleared. But with Jesse in his current condition, even a short journey might be impossible. It was while examining the map that Levi noticed something he'd missed before, a small symbol marked near what Tom had labeled as the castle's location. The symbol looked like a cabin or shelter, and beside it were the faint words, "Supply Cache," written in pencil so light it was barely visible. "Jesse," he said, his voice tight with excitement, "look at this." Tom marked a supply cache near the castle. "If it's real, if it's still there, we might not need to travel all the way back to civilization, if we can just reach that far." Jesse struggled to focus on the map through his fever-induced haze. "You think it's still there after all these years?" "Only one way to find out," Levi replied. But even as he spoke, he knew that reaching the cache would require leaving Jesse behind, something he'd sworn to himself he'd never do. They'd started this journey together, and whatever happened, they needed to finish it together. That afternoon, while tending the fire and caring for Jesse, Levi discovered something that would change everything. Among the gear that had fallen from Buster's pack during the storm was a leather journal he'd never seen before, another artifact that Tom Brennan must have hidden among their supplies. The journal's pages were filled with Tom's handwriting, documenting not just his discovery of the castle, but his subsequent visits over the years. As Levi read through the entries by firelight, a remarkable story emerged. Tom hadn't just stumbled across the castle once. He'd been returning to it for over a decade, slowly cataloguing its condition and even making minor repairs to prevent further deterioration. The journal contained detailed descriptions of the castle's current state, lists of needed repairs, and most importantly, confirmation that the structure was not only intact, but potentially habitable with the right work. "Jesse, you need to hear this," Levi said, reading aloud from Tom's journal. "The main structure is sound, with only minor roof damage in the east tower. The Great Hall retains its original timbers, and the fireplace draws well. With proper restoration, the castle could serve as a magnificent wilderness retreat for decades to come." The journal entries painted a picture of a man who'd fallen in love with von Müller's creation, who'd spent his later years secretly maintaining and protecting it while dreaming of the day he might find someone else who shared his vision. In Tom, they'd found a kindred spirit, another old man who'd recognized the castle's potential and dedicated himself to its preservation. As the storm continued to rage outside their small shelter, Jesse's fever began to break, and with it came a renewed determination to complete their quest. The journal had given them hope that their destination was not just a romantic fantasy, but a genuine architectural treasure waiting for someone with the vision and dedication to restore it to its former glory. The storm broke on the third morning, revealing a landscape so dramatically transformed that it might have belonged to another world entirely. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the meadows, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that caught the early sunlight like frozen waves. The air was crystalline and so cold it burned the lungs, but after 3 days of confinement, both men welcomed the chance to move and breathe freely again. Jesse's fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time since the storm began. His cough persisted, but the desperate, rattling quality had diminished, replaced by the more manageable congestion of a man whose body was winning its fight against illness. "I can travel," he announced as they prepared to break camp. Though his voice still carried the hoarseness of his recent ordeal. "Might not be fast, might not be pretty, but I can make it." Levi studied his friend carefully, weighing the risks of pushing forward against the dangers of remaining exposed in the high country, with winter clearly establishing its dominance. The journal entries had convinced him that their destination was worth the effort, but not at the cost of Jesse's life. "We take it slow," he said finally. "First sign you're overdoing it, we stop and reassess." Breaking camp in 3 feet of snow proved to be an exhausting ordeal that took most of the morning. Everything was buried and had to be dug out by hand. Gear, saddles, even the fire ring they'd built. The horses struggled through the deep powder, their legs disappearing to the belly with each step, while Buster proved once again that mules were superior to horses in difficult conditions. His shorter legs and broader hooves allowing him to navigate the snow with relative ease, according to Tom's map. They were less than a day's ride from Phantom Creek, but in the current conditions, that day might stretch into 2 or even 3. The trail had disappeared entirely under the blanket of white, leaving them to navigate by landmarks and compass readings, hoping that Tom's annotations were accurate enough to guide them through terrain that bore no resemblance to what they'd expected to find. Around midday, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a valley that matched Tom's description in the journal. A bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering peaks, with a stream winding through its center and stands of pine and aspen clothing its slopes. Somewhere in that valley, if Tom's accounts were to be believed, Baron von Müller's castle waited for them. But the snow had changed everything. What should have been a straightforward descent became a treacherous navigation of hidden rocks, concealed deadfall, and slopes that could trigger avalanches with a single misstep. They were forced to dismount and lead their animals, testing each foothold carefully before committing their weight to it. "There," Jesse said suddenly, pointing toward a distant stand of trees. "Do you see it?" Levi followed his friend's gaze and felt his heart skip a beat. Rising above the tree line, barely visible through the snow and shadows, was the unmistakable outline of a tower. Not the rough-hewn stonework of a frontier cabin, but the carefully crafted masonry of European architecture. Even at this distance, even through the distorting effect of snow and winter light, it was clearly artificial, clearly the work of human hands guided by architectural knowledge. "Sweet Mother of God," Levi breathed. "It's real. It's actually real." The sight of the tower transformed their careful descent into something approaching eagerness, though they forced themselves to maintain the cautious pace that winter conditions demanded. Jesse's illness was forgotten, Levi's aching joints became irrelevant, and even their animals seemed to sense that their destination was finally within reach. As they drew closer, more details emerged from the winter landscape. The tower they'd first spotted was only one of several. The castle had been built on a magnificent scale, with multiple structures connected by walls and courtyards. Much of it was overgrown with vines and small trees that had taken root in the mortar. But the basic architecture remained sound and impressive. They found Tom's supply cache exactly where his map indicated, a small cabin built into a hillside about a quarter-mile from the castle itself. The structure was simple but well built, designed to blend into the landscape and remain unobtrusive. Inside, they discovered a treasure trove of supplies that Tom had accumulated over the years. Tools, building materials, preserved food, and detailed notes about the castle's condition and the work he'd already completed. But the most remarkable discovery was Tom's workshop, a corner of the cabin dedicated to carpentry and stonework, where he'd been crafting replacement elements for the castle's deteriorating features. Wooden window frames lay carefully stacked along one wall, their design faithfully copied from the originals. Stone blocks had been shaped and fitted for specific repairs. It was the workshop of a man who dedicated his final years to a labor of love, working alone and in secret to preserve something beautiful. "Look at this," Jesse said, his voice filled with wonder as he examined Tom's handiwork. He wasn't just maintaining the place, he was restoring it piece by piece. This must have taken him years. Among Tom's papers, they found a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this place. The message was brief but heartfelt. This castle represents more than one man's dream. It stands for the belief that beauty has value, that craftsmanship matters, that some things are worth preserving simply because they elevate the human spirit. "I've done what I could in my time. I pray that someone else will carry on the work." As evening approached and they settled into Tom's cabin for the night, both men felt the weight of inheritance. They weren't just explorers anymore, or treasure hunters, or even restorers. They'd become the inheritors of a vision that stretched back to Baron von Müller's original dream, and forward to whatever future they might create. The castle loomed in the darkness beyond the cabin windows, its towers and walls silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow, they would explore it properly, assess its condition, and begin to understand the magnitude of what they'd undertaken. But tonight, warmed by Tom's stove and surrounded by his tools and dreams, they allowed themselves to believe that they'd found not just a destination, but a purpose that could define the rest of their lives. Jesse pulled out his small wooden carving of the castle and set it on the table beside Tom's architectural notes. The carved dream and the written reality seemed to acknowledge each other across the lamplight. Two different expressions of the same hope, that men could build something beautiful in the wilderness, and that beauty was worth whatever effort it required to preserve. Dawn revealed the castle in all its improbable glory, rising from the snow-covered valley like something conjured from a fairy tale. What had seemed mysterious and half-hidden in the winter twilight now stood clearly defined against the morning sky, a structure of breathtaking ambition and surprising preservation. The main keep rose 4 stories above the valley floor, its stone walls mellowed to a warm grey that complemented rather than competed with the natural landscape. Towers at each corner reached toward heaven with an elegance that spoke of European training and unlimited resources. Connecting walls formed courtyards and enclosures that suggested the castle had been planned as more than just a residence. It was designed as a complete community, but it was the details that truly amazed them. As they approached on foot, leaving their animals secured at Tom's cabin, they could see that much of the original stonework remained intact. Windows still held their frames, though the glass was long gone. Carved decorations adorned doorways and corners, their craftsmanship speaking of artisans who'd been imported from the old world to create something worthy of a Bavarian prince. The great hall's roof showed signs of Tom's repairs, new timber carefully fitted alongside the original beams, slate tiles replaced where weather had claimed them. "This isn't just a castle," Jesse said in wonder as they crossed what had once been a courtyard. "This is a masterpiece." Von Müller didn't just build a house, he created a work of art. They spent the morning exploring the exterior, marveling at the scope of the construction and the skill required to transport materials to such a remote location. Every stone had been cut and fitted with precision. Every architectural detail had been considered and crafted with care. The foundation work alone must have required years of labor by skilled masons. Yet here it stood, solid and level after nearly 50 years of mountain winters. It was Jesse who found the entrance to the main hall, massive oak doors that had weathered to silver grey but still hung true on their iron hinges. Tom's journal had mentioned that he'd managed to repair the locking mechanism, but what they found as Jesse worked the heavy latch exceeded every expectation they'd dared to hold. The great hall opened before them like a cathedral of stone and timber, its vaulted ceiling soaring overhead in a display of architectural magnificence that left both men speechless. Massive beams, dark with age but still solid, supported the roof structure in graceful arcs that drew the eye upward. Windows set high in the walls had been designed to catch and focus the mountain light, creating patterns of illumination that moved across the stone floor like living things. But it was what they found in the hall that stopped them dead in their tracks. The space wasn't empty as they'd expected. Instead, it was furnished, not with the rough-hewn furniture they might have anticipated in a frontier dwelling, but with pieces that belonged in a European palace. A massive dining table dominated the center of the room, its dark wood polished to a mirror finish despite the years. Chairs that might have seated medieval lords were arranged around it with ceremonial precision. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded, but their craftsmanship still evident. A fire lay ready in the enormous stone fireplace, as if someone had prepared it just that morning. "How is this possible?" Levi whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This place has been abandoned for 50 years. Nothing should have survived, especially not—" He stopped speaking as movement caught his eye near the far end of the hall. A figure emerged from the shadows between the pillars, an elderly man with a white beard and clothing that seemed to belong to another century entirely. He moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, but showed no surprise at finding them in what should have been his private domain. "Welcome, gentlemen," the stranger said, his voice carrying the faint trace of a German accent. "I've been expecting visitors for quite some time. My name is Klaus von Müller. Heinrich was my grandfather." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Jesse actually staggered, reaching out to steady himself against the stone wall, while Levi felt his understanding of their entire journey shift and reorganize itself around this impossible encounter. "You're supposed to be dead," Jesse managed to say, then immediately flushed at his own rudeness. "I mean, the records, the stories. Everyone said the von Müller line died out decades ago." Klaus smiled, expression of genuine warmth that transformed his austere features. "A useful fiction, I've found. It's allowed me to live here in peace, maintaining my grandfather's legacy without interference from a world that has little patience for such eccentric pursuits." As Klaus led them deeper into the castle, the scope of the deception, or perhaps protection, became clear. The structure wasn't just preserved. It was actively maintained and inhabited. Rooms had been updated with modern conveniences where practical. A generator provided electricity to key areas. A sophisticated water system brought fresh mountain water throughout the building, and what appeared to be a radio communication setup connected the isolated castle to the outside world when necessary. Tom Brennan was my friend and collaborator for nearly 15 years, Klaus explained as they toured the living quarters. He helped me maintain the fiction of the castle's abandonment while we worked together to preserve and restore what my grandfather built. His death last winter was a terrible loss, not just personally but practically. I'm 87 years old, gentlemen. The work is becoming beyond my abilities. In Klaus's private study, they discovered the most remarkable artifact yet, von Müller's original correspondence and journals, including detailed accounts of the castle's construction and the vision that had driven its creation. Heinrich von Müller hadn't been just a wealthy eccentric building a folly in the wilderness. He'd been a visionary, attempting to create a perfect synthesis of European culture and American frontier spirit. A place where art and nature could coexist in harmony. My grandfather believed that civilization didn't require cities, Klaus explained, handling the precious documents with reverence. He thought that culture, learning, and beauty could flourish anywhere, as long as someone was willing to nurture and protect them. This castle was his proof of that belief. But the most stunning revelation came when Klaus led them to a room they hadn't expected to find. A fully equipped library containing thousands of books, many of them rare volumes that belonged in museums. Art adorned the walls, including several paintings that Jesse recognized as works by famous European masters. Scientific instruments, musical compositions, and scholarly works filled the shelves and cabinets, creating a repository of human knowledge and achievement that had been secretly preserved in the Colorado wilderness for nearly half a century. The question now, Klaus said, settling into a chair that had clearly been his customary place for many years, is what happens next. I won't live much longer, and when I die, all of this will be lost unless someone else takes up the responsibility. Tom understood that. Before he died, he made me promise to find suitable inheritors, people who would understand the value of what we've preserved here. The weight of the revelation settled over Levi and Jesse like a mantle of responsibility they weren't sure they were worthy to wear. They'd come looking for adventure, for a way to give meaning to their final years. And instead, they discovered that they were being offered the chance to become guardians of a treasure beyond anything they'd imagined. Why us? Levi asked quietly. What makes you think two old mountain men are the right people to inherit something like this? Klaus's answer would change everything they thought they understood about themselves and their purpose. Because, my friends, you're the only ones who came looking. In all these years, with all the rumors and stories, you're the only ones who cared enough to make the journey, to risk everything for the possibility of finding something beautiful. That tells me more about your character than any credentials or references ever could. As they sat in the lamplight of the ancient library, surrounded by centuries of human achievement and knowledge, both men realized that their simple quest for meaning had become something far more profound, a calling to preserve and protect a legacy that transcended their own lives and connected them to something eternal and significant. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of revelation and preparation that left both Levi and Jesse feeling as though they'd stepped through a doorway into an entirely different life. Klaus proved to be a patient and generous teacher, guiding them through the intricate systems that kept the castle functioning and the careful routines that preserved its treasures. Every room held new marvels. Every corridor revealed additional responsibilities they would need to master if they were to become worthy stewards of Heinrich von Müller's legacy. The castle's library alone would have overwhelmed most men. Beyond the rare books and manuscripts, it contained detailed records of the region's natural history, geological surveys that predated anything the government had produced, and correspondence with scholars and scientists from around the world who had contributed to Heinrich's vision of creating a center of learning in the American wilderness. Klaus had continued his grandfather's tradition of correspondence. maintaining connections with universities and museums that had no idea they were dealing with a supposedly abandoned castle in the Colorado Rockies. The deception has been necessary, Klaus explained as he showed them the communication equipment hidden in what appeared to be a medieval armory. The modern world has little patience for eccentricity, especially when it involves valuable resources. If the government knew what was really here, they'd find some way to claim it for the public good, which usually means bureaucratic management and eventual decay. But it was the castle's hidden workshop that truly demonstrated the scope of what they were being asked to inherit. Klaus led them down stone steps to a basement level that rivaled any modern facility for its organization and equipment. Woodworking tools, metalworking forges, and stone-cutting equipment filled the space, along with supplies that must have taken decades to accumulate. This was where Tom Brennan had done much of his restoration work, and where Klaus continued the never-ending task of maintaining a structure that was constantly under assault from weather. Wildlife and the simple passage of time. Every nail, every board, every stone has to be perfect, Klaus said, running his hand along a workbench worn smooth by years of use. My grandfather's vision demanded nothing less than excellence, and that standard must be maintained, or the entire enterprise becomes meaningless. Jesse examined the tools with the appreciative eye of a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life. The quality was extraordinary. Many of the implements had been crafted specifically for castle maintenance, designed to match the techniques and materials used in the original construction. It was clear that maintaining this place wasn't just a job, but a calling that required both technical skill and artistic sensibility. How do you stand the isolation? Levi asked as they returned to the main level. Living alone up here year after year, responsible for all of this? Klaus paused at a window that looked out over the snow-covered valley, his expression growing thoughtful. The isolation has been both burden and blessing. There's a peace here that I've never found anywhere else, a sense of connection to something larger than myself. But I won't lie to you, there have been times when the loneliness was almost unbearable, especially after my wife died. This was the first mention Klaus had made of having been married, and both visitors looked at him with surprise. Maria lived here with me for 37 years, Klaus continued, his voice growing soft with memory. She was a remarkable woman, a scholar in her own right, a master gardener who created the terraced gardens you'll see when spring comes, and the finest companion a man could ask for. We never had children, which seemed like a tragedy at the time, but now appears to have been part of a larger plan. Without family obligations, we could dedicate ourselves completely to preserving this place. He led them to a portrait that hung in the castle's music room, a painting of a woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile, surrounded by books and flowers that suggested both learning and beauty. The painting was clearly the work of a master artist, and the love with which it had been created was evident in every brushstroke. She's been gone 5 years now, Klaus said simply. Since then, I've been preparing for this moment, when I would need to pass the responsibility to someone else. Tom's death accelerated that timeline, but perhaps it was meant to be. Perhaps his passing was what brought you here at exactly the right time. That evening, Klaus presented them with the most overwhelming artifact yet, a comprehensive manual that he and Maria had compiled over the decades, documenting every aspect of castle maintenance, from the practical details of plumbing and heating to the careful procedures required for preserving ancient manuscripts and artwork. The manual was hundreds of pages long, illustrated with detailed drawings and photographs, and represented a lifetime of accumulated knowledge about living in and maintaining such an extraordinary place. This isn't a decision you need to make immediately, Klaus said, as they studied the manual by lamplight in the Great Hall. But I need you to understand the magnitude of what I'm offering. This isn't just a house or even just a historical site. It's a living repository of human achievement, a place where knowledge and beauty are preserved not for their monetary value, but for their intrinsic worth. Levi found himself thinking about Martha, about the quiet life they'd shared in their mountain cabin, about the simple pleasures and small satisfactions that had defined their existence together. What Klaus was offering was something entirely different, a life of service to ideals that transcended personal comfort, a calling that would demand everything they had to give, but might also provide the kind of meaning they'd been seeking. Jesse was clearly struggling with similar thoughts. His weathered hands traced the pages of the maintenance manual as if trying to absorb its contents through touch alone. The responsibility was enormous, the commitment total, and the stakes almost incomprehensible. Yet both men found themselves drawn to the challenge in ways that surprised them. What about the legal aspects? Levi asked practical questions that needed answers. If the government thinks this place is abandoned, how do you maintain ownership? What happens when you die? Klaus smiled, the expression suggesting he'd been waiting for exactly this question. My grandfather was many things, but he wasn't naive about American law. The castle and its surrounding land are held in a complex trust that's been carefully maintained for decades. Legal ownership will transfer to designated stewards upon my death, provided they meet certain qualifications and commit to upholding the trust's mission. Everything has been prepared. You would become not just residents, but legal guardians of this legacy. The magnitude of what they were being offered began to sink in as Klaus showed them the trust documents, the detailed financial arrangements that would support the castle's maintenance, and the network of discreet supporters who contributed to its preservation. This wasn't the whim of an eccentric millionaire. It was a carefully planned and professionally managed enterprise dedicated to preserving something irreplaceable. How long do we have to decide? Jesse asked, his voice betraying the internal struggle between desire and fear that all three men understood. Take the time you need, Klaus replied. But understand that time is not unlimited. I'm 87 years old, and while I'm in reasonably good health, I won't live forever. If you decide you're not the right people for this responsibility, I'll need to find others before it's too late. As they prepared for bed in guest chambers that had been designed for medieval nobility, both Levi and Jesse felt the weight of decision pressing upon them like a physical burden. They'd come seeking adventure and purpose, and they'd found both in abundance. But they'd also found something they hadn't expected, a responsibility so profound and demanding that accepting it would transform the remainder of their lives in ways they could barely imagine. The castle settled around them with the ancient sounds of stone and timber adjusting to the mountain cold. While somewhere in the darkness, Klaus von Müller continued his solitary vigil over treasures that had been accumulating for nearly a century. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more wonders, and ultimately a decision that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of Heinrich von Müller's extraordinary vision. The small wooden castle that Jesse had carved sat on the nightstand between their beds, a humble reminder of how their simple quest had evolved into something far beyond anything they'd dreamed possible. The morning of decision dawned clear and brilliant, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every detail of the landscape sharp as etched glass. Levi woke before sunrise, his mind churning with the weight of choice, and found Klaus already awake in the great hall, tending a fire that cast dancing shadows across the ancient stone walls. Sleep elude you, too? Klaus asked, without turning from the flames. Hard to sleep when you're trying to figure out whether you're brave enough or foolish enough to change your entire life, Levi replied, settling into one of the medieval chairs that had somehow become comfortable through familiarity. Klaus nodded thoughtfully. I understand the struggle. When my grandfather first brought me here as a young man, I thought he was completely mad. A castle in the Colorado wilderness seemed like the fantasy of someone who'd read too many romantic novels. It took me years to understand what he was really trying to accomplish. Jesse emerged from his chamber, looking as sleepless as Levi felt. His cough had improved dramatically during their time at the castle, as if the clean mountain air and sense of purpose had worked better medicine than any doctor could provide. He joined them by the fire, and for a long moment the three men sat in contemplative silence. "I keep thinking about Tom Brennan," Jesse said finally. "How he must have felt when he first discovered this place, when Klaus first trusted him with the truth. He spent the last 15 years of his life serving something bigger than himself, and from everything I can see, those were probably the happiest years he ever had." Klaus reached into his coat and produced an unexpected artifact, a leather-bound journal that none of them had seen before. Tom left this for whoever would come after him. He completed it just weeks before he died, knowing that his time was running short. The journal contained Tom's reflections on his years at the castle, his thoughts about the meaning of preservation and stewardship, and his hopes for whoever might inherit his role. The entries revealed a man who had found profound satisfaction in service to something eternal, who had discovered that the most fulfilling life was one dedicated to protecting beauty and knowledge for future generations. "Listen to this," Klaus read aloud from one of Tom's final entries. "I came here looking for something to occupy my remaining years, and instead I found the purpose that had been missing from my entire life. This castle isn't just a building. It's proof that human beings can create something lasting and beautiful, something that transcends the limitations of individual existence. To be its guardian isn't a burden, but a privilege beyond measure." Levi felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to Tom's words. The old Irish supplier had understood something that Levi was only beginning to grasp. That meaning didn't come from what you accumulated for yourself, but from what you preserved for others. That legacy wasn't about being remembered, but about ensuring that beautiful and important things continued to exist. "There's something I need to show you," Klaus said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of advanced age. "Something that might help you understand why this decision matters so much." He led them to a room they hadn't yet explored, a circular chamber in one of the towers that served as Klaus's private observatory. Telescopes and scientific instruments filled the space, along with detailed charts of the night sky and weather patterns that stretched back decades. But it was the view from the windows that took their breath away. A panoramic vista of the entire mountain range, spread out below them like a three-dimensional map of creation itself. "My grandfather chose this location for many reasons," Klaus explained. "But one of the most important was this view. From here, you can see how everything connects. The watersheds, the wildlife corridors, the delicate balance that keeps this entire ecosystem functioning. We're not just preserving a castle. We're protecting a vantage point from which the natural world can be studied and appreciated for generations to come." As they stood looking out over the vast wilderness, Levi began to understand the true scope of what they were being offered. The castle wasn't just a repository of human culture. It was a bridge between civilization and nature, a place where both could be honored and preserved. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to make a difference that would outlast their own brief time on Earth. Jesse pulled out his wooden carving of the castle, comparing it to the reality that surrounded them. "When I made this," he said quietly, "I thought I was just keeping my hands busy during the journey. Now I realize I was trying to capture something I didn't even understand yet, the dream of building something permanent in a world where everything seems temporary." The moment of decision had arrived, though none of them spoke it aloud. In the crystalline morning light, with the weight of responsibility and opportunity pressing upon them like the mountain air itself, both Levi and Jesse felt the certainty that had been building since they'd first glimpsed the castle's towers through the snow. This was why they'd come, why Tom had hidden the map and the drawings, why their restless dissatisfaction with ordinary retirement had driven them to attempt one final adventure. They were ready to accept the calling that would define the rest of their lives. The words came from Levi first, spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who had wrestled with doubt and emerged with clarity. "We'll do it," he said simply, the declaration hanging in the mountain air like a promise that couldn't be taken back. "Whatever it requires, Whatever sacrifices we need to make, we'll take on this responsibility. Jesse nodded, his weathered face transformed by a smile that seemed to draw years from his features. It's what we've been looking for without knowing it. A chance to build something that matters, to leave the world a little better than we found it. Klaus closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were bright with moisture that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given an old man the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that his life's work will continue after he's gone." What followed was a ceremony as ancient as human. Civilization itself, the formal transfer of responsibility from one guardian to the next. Klaus led them back to the Great Hall, where he produced a document that had been prepared years earlier, waiting for this moment. The paper bore the ornate letterhead of the von Müller Trust and contained language that was both legal and ceremonial, acknowledging their acceptance of stewardship and their commitment to preserving Heinrich's vision. But more meaningful than any legal document was the artifact Klaus presented. Next, Heinrich von Meller's original seal, a heavy bronze disc engraved with the castle's coat of arms and a Latin motto that translated, "To beauty preserved is civilization defended." The seal had been used by 3 generations of guardians to mark their most important correspondence and decisions. And now it was being passed to a 4th generation. "This seal represents more than authority," Klaus explained, as Levi held the weighty bronze. "It represents continuity, the unbroken chain of commitment that extends from my grandfather through me to you, and hopefully through you to whoever comes next." They spent the day in intensive planning, laying out the practical details of the transition that would take place over the coming months. Klaus couldn't simply disappear. His absence needed to be explained to the few outsiders who knew of his existence. His legal affairs needed to be settled, and most importantly, Levi and Jesse needed time to fully understand their new responsibilities. "I'll remain here through the winter," Klaus decided, "teaching you everything you need to know about daily operations, seasonal maintenance, and the delicate relationships with suppliers and contacts who help keep this place functioning. By spring, you should be ready to take full control." The magnitude of what they'd committed to began to settle over them as Klaus outlined their future responsibilities. They would become scholars as well as caretakers, learning to maintain not just the building but the library and its precious contents. They would need to master the complex systems that kept the castle functioning while maintaining its historical authenticity. Most challenging of all, they would need to continue Klaus's correspondence with the network of academics and institutions that supported the castle's mission. "Don't be intimidated by the scholarly aspects," Klaus assured them as he showed them Heinrich's extensive notes on natural history and geology. "You both have something more valuable than formal education. You have lifetime experience living in harmony with this landscape. The castle needs practical wisdom as much as it needs academic knowledge." As evening approached, they gathered once more in the great hall for a meal that felt both celebratory and solemn. Klaus had prepared a feast using provisions from the castle's extensive stores, and the 3 men dined by candlelight at the massive table that had hosted such meals for nearly 50 years. "There's one more thing," Klaus said as they finished their meal. From beneath the table, he produced a wooden box that contained the final artifact, Heinrich von Müller's personal journals, written in German but accompanied by Klaus's English translations. These weren't architectural or business records, but the intimate thoughts of a man pursuing an impossible dream in the American wilderness. "My grandfather faced moments of doubt just as you will," Klaus said as they examined the journals. "There were times when he questioned whether the effort was worthwhile, whether anyone would ever understand what he was trying to accomplish. But he persevered because he believed that some things are worth preserving, regardless of whether they're appreciated in their own time." Reading Heinrich's words by firelight, Levi and Jesse began to understand that they were inheriting more than just property or responsibility. They were becoming part of a story that had been unfolding for nearly a century, a testament to the belief that human beings could create something beautiful and lasting, even in the most challenging circumstances. The formal moment of transition came at midnight, when Klaus handed them the keys to the castle, great iron implements that had unlocked these doors since Heinrich's time. As the keys passed from Klaus's hands to theirs, all three men felt the weight of history and the promise of future responsibility settling around them like a mantle of honor. They were no longer just two old mountain men looking for purpose. They were the guardians of something irreplaceable, the stewards of a vision that would define the rest of their lives and hopefully inspire whoever came after them. 6 months later, as spring brought new life to the High Valley, Levi McCallum stood on the castle's highest tower and surveyed the transformation that had taken place both in the landscape and in himself. The snow had given way to meadows brilliant with wildflowers. The stream ran full and clear with snowmelt, and the terraced gardens that Maria von Müller had created decades earlier were beginning to show the first green shoots of careful restoration. Klaus had departed the previous week, his teaching complete and his confidence in their abilities absolute. The transition had been emotional for all of them, Klaus heading to spend his final years with distant relatives in California, while Levi and Jesse settled into their new roles as guardians of Heinrich's extraordinary legacy. The old German had left behind more than just knowledge and responsibility. He'd left them with a profound sense of purpose that transformed every day from simple existence into meaningful service. Jesse emerged from the workshop below, his hands dirty from the morning's work on restoring the castle's medieval clock mechanism. The project had become his particular passion, combining his natural mechanical aptitude with the patient precision that the ancient timepiece demanded. Already, he'd managed to restore its basic function, and the gentle chiming of the hours had returned to the castle for the first time in decades. "The supply train will be here this afternoon," Jesse announced, referring to the monthly delivery of materials and provisions that kept the castle functioning. They'd established a system with carefully vetted suppliers who believed they were serving an eccentric but wealthy hermit. Never suspecting the true nature of what they were helping to preserve, Levi nodded, checking his pocket watch, a simple timepiece that seemed almost primitive compared to the elaborate clockwork Jesse was restoring. The afternoon would bring not just supplies, but correspondence from the network of scholars and institutions that Klaus had introduced them to. Maintaining those relationships had proven to be one of their most challenging responsibilities, requiring them to master subjects they'd never imagined studying. But the effort was worth it. Through careful correspondence, they'd already facilitated the publication of several academic papers based on research conducted using the castle's unique resources. Heinrich's geological surveys had provided data that helped modern scientists understand earthquake patterns in the region. His meteorological records had contributed to climate research that spanned more than a century. The castle wasn't just preserving knowledge. It was actively contributing to human understanding. The library had become Levi's domain, and he'd discovered an unexpected aptitude for cataloging and preservation. Working with conservators from the University of Colorado, he'd learned techniques for protecting fragile manuscripts and ensuring that the collection would survive for future generations. The work was painstaking and sometimes tedious, but it connected him to something larger than himself in ways that his previous life never had. Their biggest challenge had come when a government surveyor had arrived unannounced, investigating reports of structures in the area. For several tense days, they'd thought their secret might be exposed, but careful preparation and Klaus's long experience with such situations had saved them. Official records still listed the area as uninhabited wilderness, and they intended to keep it that way. The most remarkable change, however, was in themselves. The aches and pains that had seemed so prominent during their journey had faded, replaced by the vigor that comes from meaningful work and clear purpose. Jesse's persistent cough had disappeared entirely, while Levi's chronic loneliness had been replaced by the constant companionship of books, projects, and the steady friendship of a man who shared his newfound calling. They'd also begun to understand why Heinrich had chosen this particular location for his vision. The isolation that had once seemed daunting now felt protective, creating a sanctuary where important work could be done without interference. The spectacular natural setting provided daily inspiration and reminded them that they were preserving not just human culture, but the relationship between civilization and the wild places that had shaped it. As the afternoon supply train arrived, Levi thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, how their desperate search for meaning had led them to something beyond their wildest imagination. The faded photograph of two young men that had started their quest still sat on his desk in the library. But now it represented not lost youth, but the foundation upon which a meaningful old age had been built. Among the day's correspondence was a letter from the Smithsonian Institution, expressing interest in collaborating on a project to digitally preserve some of Heinrich's natural history illustrations. Another came from a graduate student who wanted to access the castle's meteorological records for her dissertation research. Each letter represented a connection between the castle's isolated location and the larger world of human knowledge, proof that their stewardship was making a real difference. That evening, as they shared their customary dinner in the Great Hall, Jesse produced the wooden castle carving that had traveled with them from the beginning. The small figure now held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, surrounded by Heinrich's original architectural drawings and Klaus's maintenance journals, the symbol of how dreams could become reality through determination and sacrifice. "You know what I realized today?" Jesse said as they prepared for bed. "We're not the same men who started this journey. We thought we were looking for something to restore, but what we really found was a way to restore ourselves." Levi smiled, understanding exactly what his friend meant. They'd begun their quest as two old men afraid of being forgotten, and they'd become the guardians of something that would ensure they'd never be forgotten, not because of who they were, but because of what they'd chosen to preserve for future generations. Outside the castle walls, the mountain wind carried the songs of nightbirds and the whisper of water over stone, the eternal sounds of a wilderness that had witnessed the dreams of visionaries and the dedication of those who'd chosen to serve something greater than themselves. In the morning there would be more work to do, more knowledge to preserve, more connections to maintain between the past and the future. But tonight there was peace, the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that every day spent in service to beauty and truth is a day that adds meaning to the world.